In these lab videos so far, you've seen a metal that was extremely reactive, metals that were not very reactive. You just watched a video about non-metals that aren't very reactive. In this lesson, we're going to complete the sequence. You're going to see a non-metal that is extremely reactive as we take a look at the properties of the halogens. You're going to observe, first of all, the atomic structure of the halogens, and then a real-world demo involving creating halogen gases and then observing their reactivity. Now we're going to begin like we always do by looking at where the halogens are on the periodic table. The halogens are the group that's the second from the right, way over in the nonmetal side of the periodic table. All of the halogens, the entire group, is composed of elements of nonmetals. Let's take a look at one of these nonmetals, the one that we're going to be observing in our lab. This is chlorine. Now, if you look carefully at chlorine, like we've been looking carefully at all of these different atoms from the periodic table, you'll see that chlorine has 7 electrons far away from the nucleus. If you count the ones that are farthest out, you'll see there are 7 electrons that are there. Chlorine wants to have 8 electrons in its outer shell, and one way for chlorine to do that is to violently rip just 1 electron away from another atom. Remember, when you're dealing with atoms that just need to either get rid of or gain 1 electron, it's so easy to do that they will usually do it very violently. They will react intensely. Now let's take away those 7 outer electrons in our model of the atom so we can visualize it a little bit more carefully. See, underneath those outer electrons, we have all of the inner electrons and the protons and neutrons, but since we got rid of 7 electrons, this inner core has a 7+ charge, and I'm going to put those 7 electrons back around the outside. Now we can just focus on those outer electrons as we see how chlorine interacts with other atoms. One way that chlorine interacts with other atoms is that it tends to bond with the same type of atom. It'll tend to bond with other chlorine atoms by sharing 1 pair. In order to show you that, let's look at another chlorine atom. And then if I put these 2 together, notice what happens to the number of electrons around the outside of each. Because they're sharing that 1 pair in the middle, both of these chlorine atoms have 8 electrons in their outer shell. Now you'd think that this would be a very stable arrangement for chlorine, and actually it is quite stable. It's just that chlorine really wants that 1 extra electron. They're still going to react violently with other substances when they can take an extra electron away. And that's what makes chlorine so dangerous. It will react violently with the atoms that make up your DNA, your body tissues, and it can harm them very quickly. Even a small concentration of chlorine can be very dangerous. Chlorine has some other properties that nonmetals typically have. All of the halogens typically have very low densities, low melting points, and they are brittle. They will shatter to a powder. The reason for that is because they form these molecules that are already stable in themselves. They don't need to bond to something else on the outside to make them stable. So each molecule is its own unit, and they don't really have any reason to connect with each other. Now, I showed you some of the fairly reactive nonmetals, how sometimes the electrons can all move to one side and induce that on other molecules, and it causes them to stick together with a very weak bond. That happens with some of the halogens too. They will bond together to make solids at times. It's just very easy to melt those solids to a liquid or evaporate liquids to gases. This is also what gives them their low densities, because they're just not strongly pulled together, and they're brittle because they don't have the sea of electrons that metals have that could just rearrange themselves. These electrons are stuck around the individual atoms and in the bonds between atoms. All right, let's now take a look specifically at what we're going to be doing in this lab. We are going to be observing how the halogens are extremely reactive, especially with living tissues, or what we're going to look at is something known as an organic molecule. Organic molecules are related to living organisms, living tissues. So what we're going to do is we're going to take a look at the different substances that we're going to be observing in this lab. And the first substance that is going to be a part of this lab is water. The substances that we mix together at the beginning of the lab are all dissolved in water. And here's what that looks like. We've got these water molecules that are sort of doing their thing, and then all of a sudden we put in another substance into the water molecules, and the water molecules will surround that substance. So here I have sodium hypochlorite, which is made up of atoms of sodium, atoms of oxygen, and atoms of chlorine. Sodium hypochlorite dissolves in water, which means water molecules get between the atoms and cause them to spread out from one another. You'll see that I've shown these as ions, sodium with a plus charge, and the combination of oxygen and chlorine, we call that hypochlorite, has a minus charge. These ions are still attracted to each other in the water. They just can't get next to each other because the water's in the way. This is bleach. The bleach that you can buy at the grocery store is the same substance that we're going to be using in this lab. The other substance that we're going to be using is just a little bit more dangerous than bleach. Now, bleach itself is very dangerous, very toxic to body tissues because it contains those chlorine atoms that are very dangerous. The other substance we're going to be using, hydrogen chloride or hydrochloric acid, is also extremely dangerous because it reacts very easily with tissues in your body. It's corrosive. Hydrochloric acid is something that's much more difficult to purchase. Science teachers have access to this. I don't recommend that anybody else really have access to this unless you need it for some job that you're doing with chemicals or chemistry. When you mix these substances together, a very dangerous chemical reaction happens. Let's take a look at just the atoms and molecules that are involved in this reaction. We're going to react hydrogen chloride in the hydrochloric acid with sodium hypochlorite. And here's what's going to form. First off, we're going to get salt, sodium chloride. This is the same as table salt. That substance is not very dangerous. Another substance we're going to get is water, H2O. That substance also is not very dangerous. But the third substance that we get is chlorine gas. This is the same as that 2 chlorine molecule we looked at before. Chlorine gas is extremely dangerous because even a small concentration can react with the tissues in your lungs and harm or kill you. So this is an extremely dangerous chemical reaction that we're going to be starting with. I'm going to put that chlorine on the side because that's just a part of the reaction. That's the halogen we're going to be observing. There's another substance that we're going to be using known as calcium carbide. Calcium carbide comes in pebble form, usually in a waterproof container. When you mix calcium carbide with water, a chemical reaction happens that's sort of dangerous. First off, we're going to form calcium oxide, which is a powdery substance you're going to see as a byproduct in this lab. Calcium oxide is not very dangerous. You're also going to see acetylene gas. That substance is an extremely flammable organic molecule. Now, to really understand what's going on in this lab, we have to look at the way the electrons are arranged in these substances. We already looked at the way the electrons are arranged in chlorine. They share one pair between the two atoms. But what about in the acetylene? Here's what this looks like. Each carbon atom has 4 electrons in the outer shell. Each hydrogen atom has 1. The carbon atoms are trying to get 8, according to the octet rule, to be stable. The hydrogen atoms are so small, they only need 2 in their outer shell to be stable. Here's how these atoms are going to attain stability from each other. First off, the carbons are going to share 3 pairs of electrons between them. So those 6 in the middle count for each carbon atom as a part of its outer shell. But you'll see that right now, each carbon atom only has 7 in its outer shell. They each need 1 more. So if we combine that with the 1 electron from the hydrogens, we now have stable acetylene gas. However, if you look between those 2 carbons, there's a whole lot of electrons there. And remember, chlorine is a halogen, and halogens love electrons. They want 1 more electron to become stable. So that chlorine is extremely likely to violently react with that acetylene gas because there's so many electrons there. And it will react. In fact, 2 chlorine molecules are going to react with each acetylene molecule, and we make a substance known as tetrachloroethane. Now, this tetrachloroethane is just going to remain in the water in the graduated cylinder at the end of the lab. It's not anything that participates in the reaction at all. It's just the product at the end. What you should see, though, is as this molecule is produced, there should be an extremely violent reaction between the chlorine gas molecules and the acetylene molecules with that triple bond and those 6 electrons packed inside. Now, just one more thing before we get into the actual lab. Acetylene is an organic molecule that is like a living molecule in living organisms. One thing that it has in common with living organisms is that it forms triple bonds. Inside your DNA, there are a lot of places where your body forms double bonds, where it has 4 electrons just packed in between 2 atoms. We call that an electron-dense area because there's just a lot of electrons there. That's why the halogens are so dangerous to DNA, to living tissues, because they will easily react anywhere where there's double bonds holding something together. And there are a lot of double bonds between carbon atoms in your body. So that's why you have to be very, very careful around substances that contain halogens. So now I'm just about ready to show you the halogens group of the periodic table in all of its reactive glory. But let me just recap what's going on here. I have this flask filled with bleach, sodium hypochlorite dissolved in water. To that flask, I am going to add hydrochloric acid. Here I have 10 milliliters of hydrochloric acid that I will add to the flask. When those two chemicals react with each other, they are going to produce chlorine gas. So that's the first thing you're going to see in this lab is chlorine gas being produced in that beaker, flowing through this tube that will be connected and being forced to the bottom of this cylinder of water. To this cylinder of water, I'm going to add a chemical known as calcium carbide that comes in this waterproof container. Calcium carbide is going to cause acetylene gas to form in the water as it reacts with the water. And when the chlorine bubbles and the acetylene gas bubbles react with each other, as they collide and as they rise through the water in the big graduated cylinder and collide with each other, there is going to be a spectacular chemical reaction known as underwater fireworks. Now, once I get this going, I'm going to develop some very dangerous fumes. Chlorine gas is extremely toxic. Please do not try this at home. You're going to see that I have to act very quickly to make sure that as much chlorine gas as possible makes it through the water and bubbles up instead of being trapped in the fume hood. But regardless, this is all taking place in a ventilated fume hood, so I don't have to worry about fumes building up in the room that I'm standing in. All right, let's mix the chemicals together and see what happens. First, I add the hydrochloric acid to the bleach. I stopper that right away. You see bubbles forming in the graduated cylinder. At this point, most of those bubbles are just air, but very soon they will be mostly chlorine. Now I'm going to add the calcium carbide. And I'm going to hit the lights. We'll see what happens. So what you just witnessed is calcium carbide changing to acetylene gas underwater, and then bleach reacting with hydrochloric acid to make chlorine gas. As you observed that reaction, you saw that when the chlorine met the acetylene, the chlorine attacked that triple bond with so much energy that it erupted in explosions of light under the water. Perhaps you see that white substance floating around in the water. That's that calcium oxide waste product that we predicted was going to be there in the introduction part of this lesson. Hopefully now you understand just how reactive the halogens can be, especially with organic molecules.